quite a number of letters from people here that heard it, asking some pretty good questions. So I'll cover that again a little bit, but I'm going to come at it from a different angle and go backwards to it rather than coming forwards to it this time. I'm going to sort of leap forward into the time of Moses and others and go back into that part of history so that we can see how things came together. Now, to put things into perspective, just about everything that we now know today about life and times of those old BC years, we've actually learnt onwards from the late 1800s, within the last 150 years or so. Prior to that, the Old Testament that we have was one of the very few documents of records that gave us this story in any way whatsoever. The Old Testament was never written to be history. The Old Testament was put together as a book of scripture. It was designed to underpin a growing religious establishment in the BC years, about 500, 600 BC, that sort of era. So although it was telling stories about things that happened thousands of years before that, it was designed to do a job only about 500 years before the time of Jesus. It was the building up of the Jewish Hebrew religion. To a large extent, these writings were based on mythology. They weren't meant to be history. But for the longest time, we've treated them as if they were history. One can't blame our forebears for doing this because there was nothing to compare. There were no other records available, just the Old Testament. So it became fact, it became dogma, it became absolute, and to challenge it was in some way or other regarded as heretical. Mythology became designated history. Our governing and educational establishments told us it was history, and our schools and churches have taught us that for the longest time. But now we're better informed. During this century and just a little before, tens and tens of thousands of old documents have been unearthed. They're on stone, they're on clay, they're on parchment, they're on papyrus, and they tell the whole story that we know from the Bible, but they tell it in a very, very different way. When these things were discovered and translated into English and other Western languages in the 1920s, 1930s, one would expect, as with scientific and medical discoveries, that everybody would be really excited about this. At last we've got some information. At last we're going to learn the truth about some of these characters who, although enigmatic, actually have no real purpose, it seems, in history, apart from being wandering nomads of one sort or another. But that wasn't the case. The enthusiasm wasn't there at all. The academic establishment felt threatened by it. And it's very easy to understand why, because it contradicted everything that they themselves had written to prove that they were the experts. These writings from 4, 3, 2,000, 1,000 years ago, first-hand writings are the writings of kings, of queens, of priests and chancellors, of city governors, state officials, scribes, historians, astronomers, archivists, military commanders, teachers. They're all there. Even farm workers and mine workers wrote these documents. But they are all people who wrote mythology, we're told. It seems rather odd, doesn't it, that everybody alive at a particular period in time was writing fairy tale and fabricated folklore. I think I'll write up the records of my mine working today. It'll be mythology. So that's what we're led to believe, that this is the case. You know, this is not history at all. 2,000 years ago, they dug up some huge bones in China, massive bones, and they didn't know what the hell they were. They figured that they must be the bones of a dragon. It was said that in ancient proto-historic times, the tail of a great dragon had carved the river channels through the earth of China, enabling the water to flow out to the sea. So this was a dragon. They'd found the bones. Well, it wasn't until the 1820s, it's not that long ago, that very similar bones were found. And following that, these bones were found in various parts of the world. And 170 years ago, we discovered dinosaurs. We named them dinosaur, Dinosaurus, terrible lizard. These were exactly the bones that the Chinese had found 2,000 years ago. Through that same 2,000 years, the Old Testament has actually been the equivalent of this Chinese dragon. It's been the only record that we had, and so we had to decide that it was the positive fact. We called it a dragon, we called it history. Between the 1850s and the 1930s, documents were unearthed in the Holy Land, in Syria, in Mesopotamia, and the intriguing thing about these documents was that they started to give us the names of the people that we know. Abraham, Esau, Israel, Heber, Nahor, Terah, all of these names actually cropped up on documents. So the first thing that we learned was that actually the Bible had got a certain amount of it right. These characters were real, they actually existed. What we learned also was that they weren't just the names of people, that they were the names of cities, of states, of great towns and realms that were governed by municipal governors at the time. So we have a situation where we know that these people either gave their names to the cities or the cities took their names from their governors, but clearly they were pretty important people. Now, we don't have them given to us as pretty important people, we have them given to us as nomads, as wandering tribesmen for some sort. So, one by one these documents begin to give us a different story. What I tried to do was not to divert too much into just interesting realms for the sake of it, but to try and narrow it down and to keep the Old Testament in sight throughout. By the 1880s, the governing establishments of the West absolutely detested the word archaeologist. It's not that long, it's only 100 years ago. Archaeology was new, but they hated them. They hated them so much that new laws and regulations were brought into operation. Archaeological digs suddenly in Egypt and Mesopotamia had to be approved, and they could only be funded from certain sources, and these sources were controlled by a newly designated set of authorities. And one of these authorities was called the Egyptian Exploration Fund. That was founded in Britain in 1891. On the very first page of the Articles of Association of the Egypt Exploration Fund, it said, "The fund's objective is to promote excavation work for the purpose of elucidating or illustrating the Old Testament narrative." What this meant was, in short, that if something was found by these archaeologists that could be used to support the scriptural teaching of the time, then we, the public, would be informed about it. Anything else was mythology. If it did not suit the interpretation, it was not destined to see the light of day in the public domain. That was 100 years ago. We still suffer from many of these types of regulation today. There is a hell of a lot discovered out there in these countries that we don't get to hear about. It's put under wraps, it's kept in closeted rooms beneath the museums, but we don't get to learn the truth of it. So what we're going to do, I think, today really is just to look at one example of a particularly monumentous find of that era, of the late 1800s. We'll look at one particular discovery just to give you an idea of the sort of thing that has been veiled from us. In my opinion, this is probably the most important biblical discovery ever made. There is little, if anything, beyond academic and closeted circles that are written about it at all. Within the context of the book of Exodus, there's a significant mountain named in the Bible. It sits in the range of the Sinai Peninsula, which is an upturned triangle that's between Egypt and Jordan. It's firstly called Mount Horeb, it's secondly called Mount Sinai, it's then called Mount Horeb again, and that's the name that it sticks with as the story progresses. And the story, of course, is that of Moses bringing the Israelites out of Egypt, and they meet with Jehovah on the holy mountain of Horeb in Sinai. At the time of Moses, roughly 1360 BC, that sort of era, there actually was no mountain called Mount Sinai. We must know that at the outset. There wasn't even a mountain by that name in the time of Jesus, and not even for another 300 or 400 years did Mount Sinai exist in geographical record. The translation of the Old Testament that we have today was compiled in a little before the year 1000. It is actually 600 years newer than the New Testament that we have today. So giving places names that they knew about in the year 1000, when the Crusades were thought about being launched and that sort of thing, they were giving places names that they knew at that time, not necessarily names that applied back in the time of Moses and the others, so that the people of that era would know exactly where they were talking about. Now, the mountain generally called Mount Sinai now sits in the south of that triangular peninsula. It was actually given its name and called Mount Sinai in the 4th century. A mission of Greek Christian monks decided to build a little mission there, and they decided that this was Mount Sinai of the Bible. It's sometimes called Jebel Musa, which means Mount of Moses. And there's a small Christian retreat there today. It's called St. Catherine's Monastery. But was that the mountain that actually was the Mount Sinai of the Bible, or the Mount Horeb of the Bible? It transpires that it was not. Exodus actually goes to some lengths to explain to us exactly where this magical mountain was. The mountain that Moses and the Israelites went to on their way from Egypt across to the land of Midian. It tells us that they crossed the wilderness regions of Shur and Paran, and they came to this mountain. Well, in actual fact, if one follows the route on the map, exactly the route that's given to us in Exodus, that they are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from the Mount Sinai that sits on our maps today. In fact, they travel so north across Sinai that they are within hundreds of miles of the Red Sea. They actually crossed the strip of land at the top where the Suez Canal sits today. So it seems rather strange that they should have diverted by hundreds of miles to cross the Red Sea at a point where Moses had to part the waters. Wasn't the case. They were very north of that, and it tells us where they went across there. It tells us exactly where Mount Horeb was. The word Horeb is an Arabic word. It simply means desert. Mount Horeb was desert mountain. And desert mountain is something which has been well known for a long, long time. And at the moment, this time and for this century, it's been called the mountain of Serabit el Kadim, the prominence of the Kadim. This sits about 2,600 feet above sea level, exactly where Exodus tells us it was, on the route from Egypt, the land of Goshen, across to the land of Midian. Well, in the late 1890s, the British Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie of the University College in London decided to apply to the Egyptian Exploration Fund for money to go and investigate this mountain. By 1904, he and the team were there. They were standing at the foot of Mount Serabit, and in the following year, Petrie published privately the results of their findings with photographs, records, and maps. But he added to his notes to this publication that the report that he made, despite its funding source, would not generally be made public by the Egyptian Exploration Fund. The subscribers to the fund would receive maps, they would receive little bits of information, but the detail of what they found would not be mentioned at all. The officers would simply tell even their own members what they wanted to tell from the results of Petrie's findings. Why? Had he in fact broken some regulation of the articles? Had he found something that he wasn't supposed to find? Well, that's exactly what had happened. He discovered the secret of this magical, sacred mountain of Moses. A secret which not only made absolute sense of the portrayals that we have in Exodus, but which blew the lid totally from the common scriptural interpretation of that story.